I just want to be clear with you. It's okay for a man to go into the women's section, show his penis around the other women, young little girls underage. Your spa, Wii Spa, condone that. Is that what you're saying?
In June 2021, Instagram user Cabana Angel was relaxing in the women's section of a Korean spa in Los Angeles. Korean spas are sex segregated because it's mandatory to bathe naked. Enter Darren Moraga, a naked man with a semi-erect penis walking through the women's section. Cabana Angel is understandably outraged, and she tells the staff as much.
Like I asked, it's so he could stay there. He could stay there. What sexual orientation? I see a dick. It lets me know he's a man. He's a man. He is a man. He is not no female. He is not a female. He is not a female. Hold on. He is not a female, sweetie. Okay? Girls down there, other women who are highly offended for what they just saw. And you did nothing. Absolutely nothing. In fact, you sided with him. So Wii Spa is an agreement with men that just say they are a woman and they can go down there with their penis and get into the women's section. Is that what you're saying? What really? What law? What law?
The law the employee is referring to is known informally as self-ID, because in the transgender belief system, one becomes the opposite sex simply by identifying or self-IDing as the opposite sex. And in Western countries around the world, this belief system has been made law. It allows men to change their legal sex to female without any medical interventions whatsoever. No hormones, no surgery, and no psychological assessment. All Australian states and territories now have some version of self-ID. For example, in my home state of Victoria, all a man needs to do is sign a statutory declaration saying that he's a woman, and the Births, Deaths and Marriages Office will issue him a brand new, fraudulent birth certificate that says he was born female. And just like that, women's rights become his rights. He can enter public toilets and change rooms meant for girls and women. He can compete in women's sport. If he's found guilty of committing a crime, he'll likely be housed in a women's prison, even if that crime involved rape or violence against a woman. When the Wii Spa incident blew up on social media, trans activists were quick to defend Darren Moraga's right as a transgender woman to expose his penis to women and girls. Laurie Penny, a British journalist and so-called feminist, advised teenage girls who found themselves in a Wii Spa type situation to, quote, not stare at other people's genitals without their permission because it's rude, end quote. Online magazine Slate reported that LA police were treating the incident as a hoax, and the Guardian newspaper also suggested the incident was staged. But it soon emerged that Darren Moraga was a registered sex offender with 2 prior convictions for indecent exposure. He was also awaiting trial for a 3rd charge in which he had once again exposed himself to women and children at a park. 3 years before the Wii Spa incident, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department had issued a flyer to Southern California police departments stating, quote, Moraga claims to identify as female so he can access women's locker rooms and showers, end quote. And this is the biggest danger of self-ID laws. They provide cover for sexual predators. They give flashers, peeping toms, and worse, free access to girls and women, making public life even more unsafe for the female sex. In Australia, we haven't yet had our viral Wii Spa moment, but it doesn't mean these incidents aren't happening. It just means they're not being reported. But why does there even need to be a viral incident for women's needs to be taken seriously? Isn't it obvious that predatory men will take advantage of these laws? Isn't it enough that women have said no to these men? If you haven't listened to Season 1 of Desexing Society, that's okay. But I strongly recommend at least listening to Episode 6, Autogynephilia, because the men we're talking about here in Season 2 are, in my opinion, for the most part, autogynephiles. In short, these are men who are sexually aroused by the idea or image of themselves as women. It's sexually exciting for them to use the women's toilets or play on the women's hockey team. Once you understand how this very male sexual paraphilia functions, it makes the destruction of women's rights all the more unbelievable. Welcome back for Season 2 of Desexing Society. In Season 1, we explored how transgender ideology became embedded in Australia's public health system and schools. In Season 2, I'm doing a deep dive into what it means for girls and women when men are treated as female under the law. Episode 1, Women's Sport, Part 1.
So I'm a two-time Olympian and a five-time Commonwealth Games medalist in the sport of Olympic weightlifting. I had the start of my career was in other sports, in athletics. Had a bit of a time in track cycling. Got to national level, international level in athletics, in discus throwing, and then played rugby for a season as well. And yeah, was picked in the Australian squad there too. So had a bit of a play at a few other sports, but the main sport's weightlifting.
Deborah Acason has devoted much of her adult life to sport. At the 2002 Commonwealth Games, she won 3 silver medals in weightlifting. In 2006, she won the coveted gold, and then at the 2010 Games, a bronze. In 2018, she returned for one last shot at glory at the Gold Coast Commonwealth Games.
No one in my sport has done 5 Commonwealth Games. That was a record for our sport. That was an amazing achievement because I didn't know if I'd get there, and it was quite an emotional build-up. I had a serious injury that needed surgery, but we couldn't afford it, so I didn't have the surgery just because it was going to take the last money out of my superannuation, literally. So I literally, for weeks on end, woke up just thinking, what am I going to do and am I going to make it? I'd had a heat stroke, I'd had the ambulance come, and I'd been training several times because I was pushing myself so hard to try and make it. So to actually be named in the team was such an achievement.
It is a huge achievement. I think of my own workout routine, and I really struggle to push myself beyond doing just the bare minimum. The discipline of elite athletes like Deborah just blows me away. But the fact that women's weightlifting exists at all at the elite level is an achievement in and of itself.
So it had to actually be voted and passed on to be at the 2000 Olympics. So 104 years after men competed at the first Modern Olympics in 1896, 104 years before women were voted. And it wasn't a unanimous vote. There were people that voted against having women compete in weightlifting at the Sydney 2000 Olympics. That's the information that I've got. It took so long for it to actually happen. 52 years for weightlifting at the Commonwealth Games for women. And yeah, I think it's just so significant for me because I was part of that first women's team. And I know, a lot of friends that were in that team, and it was such an achievement for us women to stand there legitimately as women being allowed to compete at a Commonwealth Games in our sport of weightlifting. And there were so many myths and misconceptions about the sport of weightlifting, that you become infertile or that women aren't capable, or, all these, you can't have babies if you lift weights, like all that sort of stuff that I spent my whole 20 years of my sport, and I still do, in changing people's misconceptions about the sport and trying to get girls into the sport. It halves your risk of osteoporosis in later life. It's such a a beneficial sport in all ways, particularly for women. That's what I spent my whole time talking about and encouraging people to get involved, particularly girls. And so I guess it's just so strange to then do, in my last Commonwealth Games, that suddenly there's a biological male in my competition. What, how and why?
Deborah is one of countless female athletes around the world who've been forced to compete against men. It's a situation that makes my blood boil, and I know I'm not alone. Polling repeatedly shows that most people do not support men competing in women's sport. In 2021, the organisation Binary Australia published polling data showing that 67% of Australians are opposed. If we were able to vote on this issue, like how we got to vote on same-sex marriage, the answer would be a resounding no. And it's a similar story overseas. In 2023, 69% of Americans said that transgender athletes should only be allowed to compete according to their quote-unquote birth gender. And for Brits, a 2024 YouGov poll found that 74% were against males competing in women's sport. For gender-critical women like me, it's astonishing that around 30% of the population are going along with this. We've always known that men are bigger and stronger than women. I bet that even our Neanderthal ancestors had figured that out. And isn't that the whole reason that women's sport is underfunded, not televised, and is the butt of many a joke? It's been just extraordinary to see the entire establishment, the politicians, the bureaucrats, big corporates, and legacy media, all try and convince ordinary people that men have no athletic advantage over women. It's gaslighting on an epic scale. If you're unfamiliar with the term gaslighting, it's a form of psychological abuse where one person intentionally makes another person doubt their perception of reality. When Deborah Acason found herself up against a man in her weightlifting comp, it sounds like her reality was somewhat destabilised.
It really wasn't till I actually saw the athlete at the weigh-in and then warming up in my competition that I literally was still sitting there thinking to myself, this is actually happening. I actually cannot believe this is actually happening at a Commonwealth Games in my category, at our home Commonwealth Games. It was still such a shock. It hadn't sunk in yet.
The athlete, as Deborah calls him, was New Zealander Laurel Hubbard. But before he was Laurel, he was Gavin Hubbard.
I just couldn't understand the logic behind it, and it just was very confusing, especially in our sport of weightlifting where it's so obvious. I just couldn't get my head around it.
Hubbard began weightlifting in his youth. In 1998, at the age of 20, he set 2 New Zealand records in the men's junior weightlifting competition. He then disappeared from the sport for over a decade. It's also worth noting that Hubbard was born into a life of wealth and privilege. His family owned Hubbard Foods, which was the 3rd largest breakfast cereal brand in New Zealand, just behind Kellogg's and Sanitarium. They sold the business in 2018 for an undisclosed amount, but it was estimated to be upwards of $30 million. At 35 years of age, Hubbard began identifying as transgender and started medical transition. By the time he was competing against Deborah at the 2018 Commonwealth Games, he was 40 years old. Deborah, on the other hand, was 35, and this was her last Commonwealth Games. Hubbard's presence alone was a major distraction.
And I really did have to refocus when I was warming up in the competition. I literally had to I had to turn the other way to just be able to concentrate on what I was doing and not get distracted. You know, as an athlete, you're focusing on your own performance the whole time. And I'd done that for a lot of years. You know, this was 20 years that I'd been doing this and was very good at what I did. So I think it was kind of that aspect that surprised me too, that it was really affecting me so much that I was losing my concentration and I was trying not to think about it. But yeah, I just felt such injustice and unfairness that I just had to keep on refocusing and just try and focus on my own competition.
Not only did Hubbard have the physical advantage of having a male body, he also had the psychological advantage because he had disrupted probably every other competitor's focus. So how did this injustice come about? For that, we largely have the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, to thank. In 2003, the IOC decided that men who had had sex reassignment surgery could compete as women at the Olympics. Somehow, they determined that the advantages of male puberty were reversed if one's penis and testicles were removed. In 2015, this changed. Men could keep their penis and testicles, but were now required to take hormone-suppressing drugs. So long as their testosterone level stayed below 10 nanomoles per litre for 1 year, the IOC considered those men to be women. But this hormone level made no sense. For one, it was 4 times higher than the normal upper range of testosterone found in women. And for another, low testosterone doesn't make a man a woman. Nevertheless, the International Weightlifting Federation went along with the IOC's policy. They sort of had to. If they didn't, the IOC could simply suspend them and run their own competition to select weightlifters for the Olympics. Unlike the IOC, the Commonwealth Games didn't actually have a specific policy on transgender athletes. They just went along with the IOC and the International Weightlifting Federation, which meant Laurel Hubbard met the criteria for the women's competition. He had passed the testosterone rule. In a twist that some might call karma, Hubbard suffered an elbow injury while attempting what could have been a women's Commonwealth record lift of 132 kilos. He withdrew from the event.
The transgender athlete from New Zealand did not place at the Commonwealth Games. But it doesn't mean that that didn't have an effect on everybody else. We still went into the competition knowing who we were up against. I still had to focus my competition in feeling like this was just an unjust situation.
Hubbard went on to compete at the 2019 Pacific Games in Samoa, stealing 2 gold medals and 1 silver from women. There's an infamous photo of him, a white man, standing on the number 1 spot on the podium, with 2nd and 3rd place Samoan women either side of him. The women are not celebrating. They've been humiliated by Hubbard. Their heads are bowed, and one of them has slightly turned her back on him. Had he been rightfully excluded from the competition, Fianinga Stowers would have won gold for Samoa instead of silver, and Unira Sapaya would have won silver rather than bronze, also for Samoa. Fianinga had overcome huge adversity to get to where she was. She'd suffered sexual abuse as a child and had lived in residential care operated by the Samoa Victim Support Group. It was here that she was introduced to weightlifting, and the sport became part of her ongoing healing. But the gold medal was stolen from her by a middle-aged white man from a very wealthy Auckland family. After his success at the Pacific Games, Hubbard set his sights on the Olympics, and in 2021, at the ripe old age of 43, he became the first man to compete as a transgender woman at the Olympic Games. But once again, it seemed karma decided to intervene, because Hubbard failed to record a single lift. He failed so spectacularly that some gender-critical women wondered if maybe he'd done it on purpose, so that trans activists could point to his failure and say, "See, trans women don't have any sporting advantage." In a press conference with the medal winners after the event, the women were asked how they felt about the whole thing.
Historic night here with Laurel Hubbard competing as the first openly transgender in a individual event. And I was wondering, what you felt about that and what you felt that it took place in your sport.
No, thank you.
That was not a glitch in the recording. There were indeed 8 seconds of silence before American bronze medalist Sarah Robles said, "No thank you." So why the silence? Why aren't female athletes up in arms about this? Why aren't more of them fighting back?
I was very strongly told to think very carefully about what I said in public, particularly before my competition. I mean, afterwards I did say how I felt a little bit more, but it really felt I couldn't say anything. I couldn't tell anyone.
Female athletes have been put in an impossible situation. Remain silent and betray your own conscience. Speak up and lose sponsorship money. Speak up and lose your spot on the team. speak up, and face a torrent of online abuse and possibly even violence from transgender activists. And that's not an exaggeration. When American college swimmer Riley Gaines realised that no one was prepared to say anything about a man winning medals in her competition, she realised she would have to do it herself. And so she did. Speaking up opened a lot of doors for her, but it also came with a price. In April 2023, she was invited to speak at an event at San Francisco State University, and all hell broke loose.
As Gaines spoke, demonstrators inside and outside of the room held signs and chanted trans rights are human rights. Gaines claimed she was ambushed and physically hit by protesters as she attempted to leave. Both Gaines and the Express posted videos showing her being escorted by police to another room. The videos show loud crowds but don't specifically show her being struck by anyone. Her representatives say she was trapped for 3 hours before she could be escorted off campus safely.
This reporter wasn't the only one to imply that Riley had lied about being assaulted. The crowd was just being loud, he tells us. But the media isn't fooling many of us. They can try and minimise the inherent violence of this situation, but obviously anyone being chased by an angry mob would be terrified. And that's the whole point, to intimidate women into silence. But, I hear you saying, if all women simply refused to compete against men, then surely this whole thing would be over and done with, right?
Maybe it's going to take a whole team of women to continually just keep doing that and just say we're not going to do it. But everyone needs to be on the same page because, you know, at the Commonwealth Games, if I said I'm not going to compete, well, then I just would have missed out and everyone else would have competed. And my issue there at that competition was I trained for 20 years. Like, that was the highlight. That was the send-off for me. That was me saying thanks to my coach, my family. It's so unfair to get to that point for me to voluntarily miss out and potentially not get a medal because I feel strongly on this point of unfairness.
At her 5th and final Commonwealth Games, Deborah just missed out on another medal, placing 4th.
Yeah, I just don't understand how it's gone this far this quickly and how it can be so acceptable when there is such clear science. You know, let's all believe in science. Well, let's look at it all. I just don't understand how that can be ignored.
I said earlier that everyone knows men are bigger and stronger than women, but the truth is, for a sizable minority, they're not convinced. So for those people, here's some science. On average, men are 9% taller than women. That means their legs and arms are longer. Men's bicep strength is a whopping 89% greater than women's. Men's quadriceps, that's the big thigh muscles, are 54% stronger. And men's grip strength is 57% greater than women's.
So grip strength is significant in a variety of sports, and holding the bar, grabbing the bar. In weightlifting, where the women's bar is actually a smaller diameter, so that's significant grip strength.
When we compare how men and women perform in different sports, in swimming, men are 11% faster. In running, they're 12% faster. In jumping events, men outperform women by 19%. And in Deborah's sport of weightlifting, men can lift 31% more than women. And it's not just men who outperform women, it's also teenage boys. The website boysversuswomen.com shows us what would happen if US high school boys were to compete against female Olympians in swimming and track and field events. The answer? The boys would win almost all of the time. Out of 29 events, the boys would win 28 gold medals and the women just 1. The website authors even had to exclude several events from the comparison, events like discus and javelin, because the teenage boys were already throwing heavier objects than the female Olympians, meaning there was no comparable event. The evidence is overwhelming that men outperform women in sport. But what happens if a man takes testosterone blockers and estrogen? does he then lose all the advantages of male puberty? Back in 2015, the International Olympic Committee decided that yes, he does. And so they implemented the testosterone rule we discussed earlier. It seems the IOC reached this conclusion by relying on a single research paper authored by a trans-identified male, Joanna Harper. Harper was a recreational runner who had noticed that his running times had gotten worse since his sex reassignment surgery. Online, he found another 8 trans-identified males who were also recreational runners, and he had them record their times. Harper found that post-transition, the men's running speed dropped by about 10 to 12%. They had apparently lost all of their performance advantage over female runners. Harper put it down to the lack of testosterone. But, as author Helen Joyce wrote in her bestseller, Trans When Ideology Meets Reality, quote, "It is hard to imagine a shakier basis for a big policy shift." Harper's paper was a collection of anecdotes, self-reported times from a handful of trans women of varying ages and training regimes, gathered over many years and lacking any controls for the multitude of factors that can affect performance. One participant became a much keener runner after transition. Another put on weight and gave up running soon after submitting times. The paper looked at recreational runners, not elite ones. Harper is frank about all these flaws. Moreover, it considered only running, one of the sports where the male advantage is slightest, end quote. The International Olympic Committee had destroyed the integrity of women's sport on the say-so of 8 amateur transgender runners. In 2021, Joanna Harper published another research paper, this one titled, "How Does Hormone Transition in Transgender Women Change Body Composition, Muscle Strength and Hemoglobin? Systematic Review with a Focus on the Implications for Sport Participation." Harper's systematic review looked at the available studies that tracked trans-identified males before and after medical intervention. The studies measured things like thigh muscle area and grip strength. All the male subjects would have passed the testosterone rule for the Olympics. This time, the results were not as favourable for transgender inclusion. Harper concluded, quote, "Hormone therapy decreases strength, lean body mass and muscle area, yet values remain above that observed in cisgender women, even after 36 months." End quote. In short, testosterone suppression did not reverse the male sporting advantage.
That's why people take drugs and dope in sport, because you can train at that high level, increase the number of muscle fibres. All those advantages don't change. So when you increase muscle fibres with testosterone, that never goes back again. So the irreversible change, again, just shows you can't, go back to a fair level. So
the thing is, we already knew this. The East Germans did the experiment decades ago and on a large scale. They ran a government-backed doping program pumping their athletes, including their female athletes, with anabolic steroids. English swimmer Sharon Davies swam against some of those women and lost. Here she's speaking on the Trigonometry podcast.
So during the 70s and the 80s, the old East Germany basically were putting an awful lot of nasty steroids, testosterone into their young girls as a program really to win in sport. They totally dominated in the women's events, obviously, because what they could do was they could create a sort of a male puberty by giving these young girls these terrible drugs from about 11, and with massive side effects. Many of them have been really poorly, some have even died. This was allowed to go on for a very long time.
The East German communist government worked out that they could give young girls these drugs, build their muscles beyond the average female range, and then enter those girls into elite competitions. They passed the drug tests because by the time they were competing, they were no longer taking the steroids. The belief that male puberty can be reversed simply isn't true.
There's still a larger body, there's still more muscle mass, it's still the vital organs in your body that are bigger and, work harder as a male. which don't change. You don't suddenly have your heart shrinking when you lower your testosterone and increase your estrogen. So it is ridiculous to think that all these things change suddenly to become like a woman and on equal level, because it just doesn't happen. So even on the basis that men still, when they seek to transition, still are faster, have better grip strength, and in general have still got all those other benefits, it's just totally unfair.
In late 2021, the International Olympic Committee released yet another policy on men's eligibility for women's sport. Sort of. It wasn't a policy, but a framework. The 6-page document is titled IOC Framework on Fairness, Inclusion and Non-Discrimination on the Basis of Gender Identity and Sex Variations. In a huge blow to female athletes the world over, the IOC gave up entirely on determining who was eligible to compete as women. Instead, they told international sporting federations to figure it out for themselves. And to help them figure it out, they should follow the IOC's so-called framework. The framework is a masterclass in doublethink. On the one hand, it prioritises transgender inclusion as the number one goal, stating, quote, "Athletes should be allowed to compete in the category that best aligns with their self-determined gender identity," end quote. Clearly, that means men should be allowed in the women's comp. But on the other hand, if sporting federations choose to issue eligibility criteria, they should do so whilst ensuring that no athlete has an unfair advantage. Okay, so now we're excluding men from the women's category. Not quite. The framework tips the scales in favour of men in women's sport by advising sporting bodies not to presume that males have an unfair advantage over females. Furthermore, if they want to exclude males, sporting federations need to prove that males are bigger, stronger and faster than females. And to do this, they need to provide robust, peer-reviewed scientific research specific to their sport. To ensure that Australian athletes would be accepted at future Olympic Games, Australian sporting bodies would have to adhere to the new IOC framework. The Australian Sports Commission, headed by former male Olympic swimming champion Kieran Perkins, held a secretive roundtable workshop to help Australian sporting federations develop their transgender guidelines. Deborah received a last-minute invitation to attend.
The gist of it was, yes, inclusion is the way to go, and we just have to work out how it happens.
2 pro-transgender presentations were made to the participants, one by ABC Darling and endocrinologist Ada Chung, and another by Chief Medical Officer at the Australian Institute of Sport, David Hughes. Unplanned, Ada Chung invited 2 male transgender participants to share their stories. Nothing was presented that challenged men's inclusion in women's sport. After the presentations, smaller breakaway groups formed to discuss the issues.
I sat in my group and I was basically, the girl next to me basically said, anyone that questions the inclusion is just, discriminatory. And she used all these terms that I kind of, I felt quite upset at that moment, because I was basically being called, you're either discriminatory, or if you're not accepting, and if you've got any questions or anything to talk about, she used another term, I can't remember, not discriminatory, bigoted, and all these really, really hateful language. And I kind of sat there and thought, well, I think it's only fair that at this point in time, I was very early pregnant, so feeling the hormones, but I was like, I really feel like I should be able to speak about my experience, because we need to hear from all different athletes, and not one of them at the table was an athlete. So, and I'd been involved in my national sport for 5 years. So, I've got lots of experience from lots of different avenues, and that international coach, national referee, been on the national board, been on state boards of other sports, mum to 3 girls and elite athlete. Like I can speak from lots of different perspectives. So So I just said, as a female, what I'd been through, my experience in sport, in a male-dominated sport, really, when I first started, how hard that was to feel like a legitimate athlete in the gym when I wasn't lifting as much as the men, and everyone cared about the big men because they always got the media because they were lifting the big weights. No one wants to see a big woman lift weights. So going against all that sort of stuff, to make my way in the sport, to actually achieve, to be, well known in the sport, to have periods, which was something that surprised them all when I started to talk about a menstrual cycle, how much that can take out of you, that a week out of every month can be affected in your training, that 1 year out of every Olympic build-up can be affected and changed in your training when you're a woman. And they never considered any of that. They all sat there with their, and I said, when I get called things, when I question the fairness because of my experience, and I get called and I hear phrases and words like bigoted and transphobic and all that sort of stuff, discriminatory, it's really upsetting. It's really, really, really upsetting because that person has no idea my story, my lived experience, what I've been through, and what it feels like right now to have someone else telling me that I should accept that and think it's fair. And they just all did not say a word for about a minute and just said, wow, we all thought we knew what we were going to do with these policies, and now I've got no idea because I'd never considered the menstrual cycle. Well, you know what? People haven't for decades, and it's only just been in the last little while that coaches and people are realising that it affects you.
Despite Deborah's best efforts, in June 2023, the Australian Sports Commission released their own guidelines on transgender participation in high-level sport. They did as they were told by the IOC and prioritised transgender inclusion. But internationally, not all sporting federations have followed suit. In June 2022, World Aquatics, who were then called FINA, which is a French acronym that translates to International Swimming Federation, FINA released a policy effectively barring men from competing as women. Males would have to prove that they had not gone through male puberty. However, transgender women would still be eligible to compete in the men's competition. In reaching this conclusion, FINA had convened 3 working groups: an athlete group, a science and medicine group, and a legal and human rights group. The athlete group held the view that fairness must be the primary objective. The science group confirmed what we already know, that in sport, males outperform women and medical transition does not mitigate the male sporting advantage. In light of the science group's findings, the legal group found that excluding males was necessary in order to not discriminate against women. On top of all that, FINA had surveyed hundreds of their athletes, and 83.8% of them said that eligibility for the women's category should be based on biological sex. Despite all of this effort and the experts involved in drafting the policy, Kieran Perkins, the head of the Australian Sports Commission, suggested that FINA had got it wrong. He said, quote, "I read FINA talking about the science has been proved. What proof? Everything that I have seen suggests that actually we're not really sure yet." End quote. Let's pretend for a moment that this is true, that the science is out. Well then, why is sport erring on the side of male inclusion? Isn't it incumbent upon those who want men in women's sport to prove to us that it's fair? Perkins went on to suggest that if the FINA policy was to filter down to community sport, there would be human carnage. Yes, he actually said human carnage. He then went on Channel 9's Today Show and told Australian women that fairness in their sport doesn't matter.
But I really struggle with any conversation that is reduced to a comment of fairness. I think that anyone that can give you a direct and clear indication of what they believe fairness is has automatically decided to ignore the views of other people. And we need to set fairness aside for a minute and actually have a real conversation about what is sport trying to achieve, what is sport's role in society.
All this from a man who won 4 Olympic medals and 6 Commonwealth medals in men's swimming. To be clear, men's swimming is not impacted by women who think they're men demanding to be included. Kieran Perkins would never have been disadvantaged by transgender athletes in his sport. It's only women who are affected, which makes it discrimination on the basis of sex.
I think by just saying inclusion is the biggest thing, is the main thing, it's basically just saying we don't care about anything that women's sports ever achieved. Why give out women's scholarships, like sports scholarships? Why give out, why make a big whoop-de-doo about women in sport? Because it's not going to mean anything.
It's also like, why even have the women's category at all? Why not just make it open and see who wins?
What happens.
Or how about we just allow doping in sport? If, as according to Kieran Perkins, fairness doesn't matter in women's sport, then it doesn't matter in men's sport either. So how about we introduce a rule that allows bottom-ranked male swimmers to take anabolic steroids? The bottom line is that men in women's sport is cheating. We have categories in sport for a reason. We don't allow 16-year-olds to compete against 10-year-olds because it's unfair. We have separate weight categories in boxing so that featherweights who weigh less than 60 kilos aren't getting smashed by heavyweights who weigh more than 90 kilos. And at the Paralympics, there are all sorts of different categories to ensure fairness. So why aren't women entitled to fairness in sport?
I'm coming from 20 years of drug testing, peeing in a cup naked in front of someone to prove that I don't have an advantage. And then I line up against a biological male? That's where I'm coming from.
What's the first thing that comes to mind when you hear the words 2024 Paris Olympics? Perhaps it's the brilliant breakdancing skills of Aussie champ Ray Gunn. Or maybe you thought of the super laid-back and very cool Turkish pistol shooter Yusuf Dikeç. Or did your mind go straight to French male pole vaulter Anthony Amirati, who proved once and for all that, contrary to what trans activists say, what's between your legs really does matter when it comes to sport? Anthony went viral during the Games for accidentally knocking the crossbar off with his penis. But if you're a gender-critical woman like me, it's probably the case that when you think of the 2024 Paris Olympics, you think of Imani Khalif, the male athlete who was allowed to punch women in the face in the boxing ring. I can already hear some of you saying, but Stasia, Khalif is a woman with an intersex condition. Well, you're half right. According to leaked documents, Khalif does have an intersex condition, but it's a condition that only affects males. Now, I'm not a biologist, so I tracked down an actual biologist to help explain how Imani Khalif and men like him have found their way into women's sport. But because transgender activists have been known to destroy women's careers, this biologist has chosen not to use her real name. We'll call her Dr. Lisa Milner.
I'm a scientific researcher with a diverse background in the biological sciences. So I've worked in a whole range of fields and studied lots of subjects such as comparative anatomy, pathology, pharmacology, bioethics, biotech. So I've got a broad sort of scope on these issues.
Lisa is also critical of the transgender movement and has spent some time educating herself on intersex conditions, which are also known as DSDs.
The term DSD stands for disorders or differences of sex development. So these are conditions where through either the sex chromosomes, the gonads, or the anatomy, do not develop in the typical way of male and female. It doesn't mean they're not male or female, but they're differences along those pathways of development. These can be very minor differences that may not even be picked up until an individual is either going through puberty or trying to start a family, or there could be major differences that cause issues when they're a baby and can actually be life-threatening. The other term used, of course, is intersex. Some people consider it offensive because implies something in between male and female rather than variations within the sex binary of male or female. So it sort of is up to the individual which term they prefer. I think DSD seems to be the least offensive and the least controversial.
To explain the two DSDs that have impacted women's sport, we're going to be talking about chromosomes. So before we go any further, let's do a mini refresher course in high school biology to remind ourselves, what are chromosomes?
Chromosomes are the structures inside the nucleus of every nucleated cell in our body, and they contain our genetic information, so tightly coiled DNA. So humans have 46 chromosomes. We have 23 pairs. One of those pairs are called sex chromosomes, and they are the ones that determine whether we're male or female. They're either an X or a Y. If you are female, you have 2 X chromosomes. You get one from your father, one from your mother. If you are male, you have an X chromosome and a Y chromosome. The X always comes from the mother and the Y from the father. So it's in humans, it's the father that determines the sex of the babies.
Back when the IOC still cared about fairness in women's sport, they used a simple chromosome test to make sure female athletes were in fact female. All it took was a cheek swab. And this worked just fine for about 20 years, right up until a person with a DSD called complete androgen insensitivity syndrome, or CASE, complained that they had been unfairly excluded by the test. People with CASE have XY chromosomes, internal testes, and produce male sex hormones known as androgens. However, their bodies don't respond to those androgens. In utero, it's the androgen testosterone that tells a developing fetus to start growing penile tissue. But because their bodies don't respond to testosterone, the signal isn't received. Instead, people with CASE develop external genitalia that appears female.
As a teenager, you've believed that you're female your whole life in every normal way, and then discover that you don't get your period as your friends do, have some testing and you find out you have XY chromosomes and internal testes. It doesn't mean they're not female, and I think everyone, society should consider them female if that's what they want. But it does mean they're unable to bear children, and again, it must be a really difficult one to have to deal with.
There's some disagreement over whether people with CASE should be counted as female. Personally, I agree with Lisa that society should consider them female if that's what they want. But with XY chromosomes and internal testes, technically they're male. That said, when it comes to women's sport, given that they have none of the advantages of male puberty, this is the one case of XY chromosomes that I think should be included in women's sport. But of course, that's up for debate. But the DSD that causes the most problems in women's sport is known as 5ARD.
So the case of Caster Semenya is probably the most famous case of a DSD athlete. And there's several reasons for that. It has been going on for a long time. There have been court cases. There have been multiple international bodies involved. Caster Semenya is a South African sprint athlete who has been diagnosed with 5ARD. That's pretty widely reported.
5ARD. What does that mean? The top Google result takes me to a website called medlineplus.gov, which is an official website of the US government. It states, quote, 5-alpha reductase deficiency is a condition that affects sexual development before birth and during puberty. People with this condition are genetically male, with one X and one Y chromosome in each cell, and they have male gonads, testes. Their bodies, however, do not produce enough of a hormone called dihydrotestosterone, DHT. DHT has a critical role in male sexual development, and a shortage of this hormone disrupts the formation of the external sex organs before birth. End quote.
So what happens is when the baby's developing, they have an active SRY gene on the Y chromosome, which means they produce testes in the developing embryo fetus, the internal. But further development is then stopped because they're not able to produce DHT. And so the baby then produces external genitalia looking more female or completely female. When they're born, they're identified as, or we actually use the term assigned female at birth, because in that case they are being assigned female. They're assigned female at birth and they're raised as a girl. Once they start puberty, instead of developing breasts, starting their periods and things that a girl would, they start to go through a male puberty because they have internal testes that produce normal levels of testosterone, and so they go through a male puberty. I can't imagine what it would be like to be raised as a girl and discover at puberty you start developing as a boy. It must be incredibly traumatic and a very difficult experience for everyone to have to deal with.
Caster Semenya is male, and because he's gone through male puberty, he knows that he's male. Despite this, he stole 2 Olympic gold medals from women.
Of particular relevance is the 2016 Olympics in Rio. In the 800 metres women's race, Caster Semenya won the gold medal. The 2 athletes that came second and third, so all 3 on the podium, have been identified as having DSDs, and they're all thought to have 5 ARD. So this is a very rare DSD. So the fact we have 3 athletes winning gold, silver and bronze in the same event with this condition tells us a lot about what needs to be done to keep women's sports fair.
It's pretty obvious to me what needs to be done, and that is reintroduce chromosome testing. And if a Y chromosome shows up, then do some more tests. It's really not that hard. Unless, of course, you're the International Olympic Committee. Which brings us back to boxing gold medalist Imane Khalif.
I think the case of Imane Khalif it's the most extreme example of a failure to set proper policy around DSDs and athletes. We have the International Olympic Committee basically saying that if your documents say you're female, you can participate in women's boxing at the most elite level in the world. It's the one area where you would think there should be absolutely no ambiguity about whether an individual qualifies to be in that sport in the women's protected category. They're literally punching each other in the face. We know that the difference between men and women with sports, it varies in different categories. The force of punching is the one that stands out as the highest. It's been estimated 162% more powerful in men on average than in women.
Let me just emphasise that. The force of a man's punch is 162% more powerful than a woman's.
So the fact that it got to the point where we have women's boxing and we're questioning whether not one but actually 2 of the competitors are male or female, there should have been no doubt about this. They should have cleared this up well in advance.
The other boxer suspected of being male was Lin Yuting, representing Taiwan. As we've already discussed, in 2021, the IOC gave up on determining who is eligible for women's sport. They told international sporting federations to come up with their own rules.
For boxing, this is the International Boxing Association, but they themselves were suspended for their own internal issues, and so the IOC took responsibility for this role. So instead of following the IBA's guidelines, which was sort of genetic testing and things, they just said, well, if it says female on your passport and we can see it's on your birth certificate and you grew up that way, that's enough for us. We know that Khalif had failed 2 tests by international laboratories, so independent of the IBA, and those tests were based on karyotype, so that's genetic testing. So although we're not able to see all the exact results for privacy reasons, it is fair to say that this individual has XY chromosomes, and so further testing is required.
Both Imani Khalif and Lin Yuting had been barred from women's boxing for failing gender tests commissioned by the International Boxing Association. And yet, at the height of the controversy, Thomas Bach, then the president of the International Olympic Committee, went before a press conference and told the world the following.
Let's be very clear here. We are talking about women's boxing. And we have two boxers who are born as a woman, who have been raised as a woman, who have a passport as a woman, and who have competed for many years as women. And this is the clear definition of a woman. There was never any doubt about them being a woman.
This has since been shown to be a bold-faced lie, at least in the case of Khalif, because 3 months after the Olympics closing ceremony, a very thorough medical report was leaked to French journalist Jafar Ait Aoudia. The report, signed off by 2 expert endocrinologists, revealed that Imani Khalif has the same DSD as Caster Semenya, 5-alpha reductase deficiency. An MRI confirmed the absence of a uterus and the presence of internal testes. A blood test showed that those testes were producing normal male levels of testosterone. And genetic testing found that Khalif has XY chromosomes. Imani Khalif is a man. He won gold for Algeria in the women's welterweight boxing event. And Lin Yuting also stole the women's gold in the featherweight competition. I'm recording this exciting update on the 31st of May 2025. Just yesterday, World Boxing announced that they're reintroducing sex testing as part of a new policy on sex, age and weight. The decision was made so as to, quote, ensure the safety of all participants and deliver a competitive, level playing field for men and women, end quote. Finally, it's a win for women's boxing. At the end of the day, every time a man is allowed into women's sport, women miss out, as Deborah knows all too well.
Another girl, my fellow competitor from New Zealand, missed out on going to the Olympic Games because of that transgender athlete. That's a massive effect that people never forget, the time that they missed out on going to the Olympic Games.
We don't even know that woman's name, but we know the name Laurel Hubbard. Whether it's men who say they're women or men who have a difference of sex development, men don't belong in women's sport.
You should just be able to say, because of the strength, stamina and physique required in this sport, we can't let this happen, sorry. And that's it, that's the end of it. Case closed.
In the next episode of Desexing Society, we'll examine how Australia has responded to men who want to compete in women's sport.
It was Sport Australia, it was the Australian Human Rights Commission. They put forward those trans inclusion guidelines.
The Australian Human Rights Commission completely and utterly misrepresent that law.
All a man or boy has to do is show up and register as female, and he is entitled to play in the female category.
Thanks for listening to Desexing Society. Written and produced by me, Stasia Fry. Thank you to my script editor, Miss Edie Wyatt, my sound technician, Matthew Friend, and to Deborah Acason and Dr. Lisa Milner for contributing to this episode. For more information or to donate towards this project, which I paid for myself, please visit desexingsociety.com.